Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight as we launch our new series on making a difference, as well as a new series on sustainability. And we're kicking off these programs with a really exciting discussion with the founders of three dynamic organizations driving New York's sustainability and inspiring action on the environmental crises we face. So I'm delighted to have Miranda Massey, director and co-founder of the Climate Museum, Pete Malinowski, executive director and co-founder of the Billion Oyster Project, and Silda Wall Spitzer, founder of New York Makers, join me tonight. And we'll be discussing their journeys from having a dream to launching their organizations, what their organizations are currently doing to make a difference, and also their vision for the future. Thank you to the Princeton Club of New York, who's sponsoring tonight's program, and to our co-sponsors, the Yale Nonprofit Alumni Alliance and Conscious Capitalism, New York City. So it's really a pleasure to introduce our inspiring speakers tonight. I'm going to start with Miranda Massey. As I said, she's director and founder of New York City's Climate Museum, which is the first climate dedicated museum in the United States. And its goal is to encourage broad civic engagement so the public feels empowered to take action on the climate crisis rather than feeling outscaled by the magnitude of its devastating consequences. Miranda has numerous Climate Museum guest teaching engagements, including master's programs at NYU and at Columbia University. In 2014, she left a successful career in social justice law to lay the groundwork for the museum, and we'll be hearing more about that later. Her prior honors as a civil rights impact litigator include Fletcher Foundation, W.E.B. Du Bois Institute, and Harvard Law School Wasserstein Public Interest Fellowships, as well as a mentorship in residence at Yale Law School. Pete Malinowitz grew up farming oysters with his parents on the Fisher's Island oyster farm. After graduating with a BA in biology from Vassar College, he began working at the New York Harbor School, where he founded the aquaculture and oyster restoration programs. After 5 years as a public school teacher, Pete left Harbor School in 2014 to develop Billion Oyster Project, where he's now executive director. And just very briefly, because each of our panelists will be talking to you and describing their organizations in more detail, Billion Oyster Project is a nonprofit organization on a mission to restore oyster reefs to New York Harbor through public education initiatives. And the project has planted 47 million oysters across 12 acres and 15 reef sites with the help of more than 8,000 students and 10,000 volunteers. And Silda A. Wall Spitzer is a businesswoman, lawyer, and former First Lady of New York State. She's also co-founder, CEO, and publisher of New York Makers, which we're going to be talking about tonight. And she founded the organization with Princeton alumna Christine Murphy Pillai to promote local sustainability and statewide community. Silda serves on the advisory boards of several startup companies in environmental, digital technology, and healthcare areas. She's also involved in a range of not-for-profit endeavors with a special focus on the environment, education, youth engagement, and women's empowerment. Silda has launched green buildings, alternative energy, and local food initiatives. She's worked in the financial investment industry and practiced as a corporate lawyer. She holds a JD from Harvard Law School and an honorary doctorate and BA summa cum laude from Meredith College. And Silda asked me to note that most importantly, she's the grateful mother of 3 strong daughters, one of whom is a Princeton alum. And I'm Wendy Gerber. I'll be the moderator tonight. I'm CEO of International Consulting Group, a global strategy, branding, and marketing consulting firm driving business growth for many of the leading corporations with a triple bottom line approach focused on environmental, social, and governance strategy and integration. And I lead marketing, communications, corporate strategy, sustainability, and employee engagement for global corporations working with companies including Ralph Lauren, Citigroup, and Kenneth Cole. I'm also on the board of directors of Conscious Capitalism New York City, one of our co-sponsors tonight, which is an organization driving the movement to reimagine capitalism and build purpose-driven business models. And I'm a graduate of Princeton and NYU Law School, like Miranda, and I also studied at the Wharton School. So to give you a framework for what we're going to be doing tonight, we'll chat for about 45 to 50 minutes, and then our speakers will answer questions from the audience for about 15 minutes. Please remember to click on the Q&A tab and type your questions into the box, and then we'll get to as many as we can. So let's start by having each of our panelists give us a quick background on their organizations. Miranda, why don't you start about the Climate Museum?
Thank you so much, Wendy, and a big thanks to the Princeton Club. It's really an honor to be here with you two, Pete and Silda. And thank you to everybody for joining us. Wendy, as you said, we're the first climate dedicated museum in the US, one of the first in the world. We started doing public facing programming 3 years ago. That's included a number of exhibitions, youth programs, science outreach and programming, and much, much more. Our basic theory of change is that by combining the popularity of cultural sector institutions with the public trust that they enjoy, museums, plural, can have a transformational impact. And so we work coalitionally with other museums that aren't climate dedicated to try to work toward the cultural shift toward intense, broad public engagement with the climate crisis that we need to support a new kind of public policy in this moment.
Thank you so much. Pete, can you tell us about the Billion Oyster Project?
Sure. Thank you so much for having me, Wendy and the Princeton Club. It's great to be here. So I love that you started with your theory of change, Miranda. So our theory of change is that the best way to improve outcomes for the natural environment and for public school students is to train students to restore the environment, and that pursuing those two agendas separately is a mistake, and students learn better when they're engaged in hands-on purposeful education. And for us at Billion Oyster Project, that happens at the water's edge in New York Harbor. New York Harbor used to be full of oysters. We destroyed all of those oyster reefs, and in doing so, cut the ecosystem off at the knees. So if you look out at New York Harbor, what you're looking at is essentially a 200,000 acre forest that's had all of its trees removed. So they're the same size as the land area of New York City, and yet, a completely degraded natural system. And we think that by restoring the oyster reefs to New York Harbor, we can restore those ecosystem services, and in the process, rebuild the connection that New Yorkers used to have with the harbor that surrounds us. New York Harbor is New York City's biggest and best looking open space, and also the most underutilized by New Yorkers. And so we hope that by 2035, we can engage 1 million people in restoring 1 billion oysters, and through that, change how we all think about and interact with New York Harbor.
Thank you so much, Pete. And that's a wonderful visualization to think of the harbor as a forest with all the trees cut down. So thanks very much for that. Silda, we'd love to hear about New York Makers.
Wonderful. Well, I want to add my thanks to start off to Miranda and Pete for joining, you, Wendy, for leading this moderated discussion, and of course to the Princeton Club and the other sponsors for the event. So thank you very much. I really appreciated to be able to have engaged in this conversation. New York Makers is the online marketplace and magazine for New York State, where every product has a story. At its core, it is innovative because there really was nothing like this out there that combined the storytelling together with actually being able to buy products together for states, and very purpose driven in its business enterprise. And you noted I had started this with Christine Murphy Pillai, who is a very proud Princeton alum. And the purpose was really kind of twofold: to promote local sustainability as well as statewide community. And so the actual marketplace is an economic and resource platform for makers across New York State. The marketplace gives customers access to a curated collection of quality, locally created products, from handcrafted to high tech. And the magazine really champions the stories of our makers, where we live, and the creativeness that is around us.
Well, thank you so much. Those are really very vivid stories of the impact you've made. I love the concept of the theory of change that Miranda and Pete talked about, and how you're focusing on bringing young people in to really make a difference. And Silda, how you're building a spirit of entrepreneurism and really bringing together sustainable products from across New York. So you've clearly made a difference in your respective areas. And many people in our audience, I'm sure, also want to make a difference and create a more sustainable world, but don't really know how. You all have incredibly managed to do both. So I'd love to start with talking about your journey. And since the series is about making a difference, I'd love to know what made each of you passionate enough to start your organization. Let's start with you, Miranda.
What made me passionate enough was the inequality built into the climate crisis. The crisis of inequality and the climate emergency are thoroughly interpenetrating and inextricably bound up with each other. And I think that's now a commonplace. It wasn't always one, and it's politically healthy in a civic sense that it's become a common understanding. I was working on civil rights impact litigation, as you mentioned, Wendy, particularly focused on racial justice in education. And I came to see that the climate crisis is the greatest intensifier of inequality that our species has ever encountered or created, that our species has ever had to confront, perhaps most importantly. And that compelled me to want to dedicate my energies to working on this huge central source of human inequalities among nations, within our own cities, on the differentiated streets of New York City. The climate crisis is impacting communities very differently on the basis of class and race differences. And that was the spark that drew me into it, and is at once an overarching existential crisis for all of life on Earth, including human life. That might sound hyperbolic, but the last time there was this much carbon dioxide in the air, the oceans were at least 70 feet above where they are now. And the closest thing to a human being was that monkey that was named Lucy, that was discovered in what's now Ethiopia when I was a small child. So we face an emergency and we have to cope with it. And it's a crisis of massive proportions and inequalities built into it. And that was very motivating to me.
And it's even more dramatic now as we're dealing with COVID and seeing the disparities and how that's affected people. It's equally true that with the climate crisis, that there's a great disparity and impact. So Silda, let's move on to you. What made you passionate enough to start New York Makers?
Well, the through line in my different phases of career has been building sustainable community in various forms, and I am a problem solver by nature. When I was traveling around the state before and as First Lady, two issues. One is seeing how I would go into communities and there were incredible makers doing incredible things in a context of counties and communities that were really struggling economically. And so that was one piece. And the other was then I would go to the next community, the next county, and they would have no idea what was going on in the county right beside. So this state historically has had very little kind of identity, interconnectedness as a state. It's very heavily been sort of regional or locally, or the big bad New York City versus the rest of the state. And so trying to come up with something that would bring that together and let us realize that we all can benefit from each other and we're actually all part of one another was a big piece that was motivating me. And then to do that in a way that could actually offer some economic help for these different makers by building a larger platform. The real spur for me was coming from North Carolina as my birth state. And every time I'd go back to visit, there's something called Our State Magazine. And it's on the coffee table and it's telling about different parts of the state. And when I came back here, I realized there were a lot of regional publications and local publications, but to anything I have ever been able to find, there has never been a New York State magazine. So the idea was starting with a hard magazine, and then the time was really not right in the publishing industry when I started looking at it. So kind of shelved the idea. And a couple of years later, I'm back in North Carolina and there's that magazine. And I was just, the light bulb went off and it's like, I've been working with Christine on other things and it's like, she's really tech savvy. Why don't we just do all of this digitally? And so that's where we got started. And it was something that I just cared so much about. I couldn't quite let it go, even though I tried.
Thank you for that, Zilda. So Pete, how about for you? What made you passionate about Billion Oyster Project?
Well, Wendy, as you mentioned, I grew up farming oysters with my family. My parents have a small family-run oyster farm on Fisher's Island. And so that meant that I grew up sort of on boats, in the water, under the water, completely participating in the oyster farming experience from, I learned how to drive a boat at the same time I learned how to ride a bike. And it's an incredibly privileged way to grow up, to have that intimate connection with the natural world. And combining that with the fact that I was never a particularly successful student and really did not like school, I had this amazing learning experience that was happening alongside school, and frustrating my parents throughout my high school career, and at the same time developing this complex knowledge around natural systems and how to grow oysters. And so that left me very interested in getting into teaching as a starting point. And I moved to New York after college and was looking to get into some teaching programs, and I met Murray Fisher, who had started the New York Harbor School, which is a public high school completely dedicated to New York Harbor and preparing students for careers on the water. And the hands-on learning aspects of Harbor School were directly in line with what I had developed my own philosophy around learning. And so I talked to Murray about he asked me the first time we sat down if we could connect New York Harbor School students with a harbor-wide project to improve New York Harbor. And we landed on oyster restoration, and then just sort of went from there. And so that was like very much the idea that I could play a small role in providing access to the experiences that I had growing up to, the 1.1 million public school students in New York City through Harbor School and then through Billy and Oyster Project was a perfect fit. And I've just been sort of running with that ever since.
That's a terrific story. So my next question, because some people are wondering, do you have to start out directly doing the goal to make a difference, or can you take more of a circuitous route? So I feel like, Silda, you and Pete kind of shared your journey. Pete's was a little more direct, though still had a winding trail. And Silda, yours definitely was a bit circuitous. But Miranda, as I recall from our conversation, yours was quite a circuitous journey. And I'd love it if you would share it with our audience so we can inspire them about how change develops.
Yeah, it was like a lot of people who start to become aware of the climate crisis. And this is a word of encouragement to anybody out there who's listening who feels like this about it. I kept just kind of guiltily pushing it out of my mind. It's so huge. You feel implicated in it. It's hard to know where to start. We've been trained to think that we don't have any agency in relation to it by the fossil fuel industry's propaganda machine. There are all kinds of different reasons why we feel disempowered, complicit, and otherwise shut down in relation to climate. And I did for years. And what finally tipped it over for me was a combination of things, certainly. But one of the key ingredients was Superstorm Sandy and the experience of being in New York City during that storm and having that physical. I was perfectly fine. So it wasn't any great hardship, loss of electricity for a couple of weeks. And so I moved in with my best friend and her family on the Upper West Side, where the electricity never even went out. So it wasn't an experience of hardship. It was an experience of reality and seeing how it impacted the city as a whole. And there was a tectonic plate shift in me, and all of that kind of pushing away, pushing climate to the side, pushing this growing sense that I'd always had the incredible privilege, to use your term, Pete, of being able to work on the things that felt most compelling and urgent to me. And climate change kept trying to turn my head, and I kept looking the other way. Sandy made that impossible. The idea for the Climate Museum was dropped into my head like a nickel into a piggy bank. A couple of weeks later, I 100% believed that I'd read about it somewhere and was inadvertently plagiarizing, because it seemed and continues to seem like such a completely obvious mechanism for engaging a broad public beyond the activist vanguard, which is essential, but we also need the broad public to be grappling with the climate crisis and taking civic action on it. I was amazed that this project wasn't already underway. I'd gone to my computer trying to figure out who was working on it so I could go help them. Because if you ask my mom, she would tell you that I'm pathologically lacking in risk aversion. Because I am less risk averse than your average bear, I decided it was absolutely necessary simply to start. And I remember having a kind of ticker tape thought, those conscious thoughts that you have that acquire a sentence formation. You don't know what you're getting yourself into. And I occasionally reflect on that with amusement, because it is very, very true that I had no idea what I was getting myself into starting this organization. But it's been by far in a very, very deeply rewarding work life. In my own way, I was a hampered student too, Pete, but very well equipped to front. I had that very narrow band of school skills, but I was never really in it. And this has been something that I've been able to dedicate myself to fully. So it's rewarded that effort very, very richly.
Thanks, Miranda. And let's talk about the actual work you're doing. and the urgency and promise of this moment in terms of your cultural work on climate and environmental issues?
Well, as I mentioned before, we're in a moment of intense jeopardy, and we need very, very swift and sweeping action on the climate crisis. I won't recite all the basic data. I know that everybody who's here is reading the headlines and has an understanding of how grave the jeopardy is. It's very, very profound, and even in the new administration, we're not geared up sufficiently to take action that's commensurate with the challenge. That's what the climate economists and the scientists are telling us. And I believe in expertise. I believe in science. I believe in empirical study. And it's clear that we need to generate significantly more support and pressure for very, very robust and ambitious action across all sectors. And we're taking a huge and unprecedented step toward that now, but we need much more. So it's a contradictory moment with immense promise and a new kind of promise. On the one hand, certainly hugely new levels of awareness. I mean, the social mindset that we're intervening has dramatically changed over the last couple of years. But also the climate crisis is intensifying in an accelerating way. And I know that Pete and Silda are thinking about that too. And we need a new level of the kinds of community that you guys are also talking about to come together and address these challenges that we face in a whole new way, because the challenges are entirely new in their scale and character.
And I think it's true that in addition to the community, we're talking about bringing people together. There's also a tremendous need to bring corporations together to collaborate on driving change and sharing ideas. So this is part of a sustainability series, and we're bringing together leaders in the next two programs from companies like Colgate, where they developed a recyclable toothpaste tube. And it took them 5 years to create the technology to do that. And when they released it, they shared that technology with other companies. And that's the kind of collaboration and sense of community that we need with the public at large, and also across industry sectors, really. So, Pete, you have noted that it took less than 100 years for New Yorkers to wipe out the entire oyster population in New York Harbor, or by your analogy, to wipe out all the trees in the forest if we looked at our harbor that way. And you're trying to rebuild the oyster population one shell at a time. It's amazing to me when I read about your organization that a single oyster can filter nitrogen pollution from about 50 gallons of water a day. That's just incredible. How did you come up with that concept, the research, and what kinds of projects is Billion Oyster Project working on now?
Well, I think the concept and the research is just looking backwards and seeing how things used to be and how the ecosystem used to function, and then working toward to recreate some semblance of that going forward. Our projects, so we think of our work in three big buckets: community engagement, oyster restoration, and education programs. So we build oyster reefs. We have about a dozen reefs around the harbor, and then of varying sizes, some multi-acre sites. And then we have about 100 school partners in all 5 boroughs. And each of those schools has an oyster research station at a site near their school. And that's a simple wire box with live oysters in it. And we've developed a 6th through 8th grade STEM curriculum that hits all the standards for next generation science standards and the scope and sequence for New York City middle schools. But whenever it's appropriate, relates the teaching and learning back to New York Harbor and back to the ecosystem that exists here and oyster restoration. So the idea is, right now, today, during the school day, there were thousands of public school students who, instead of seeing pictures of prairie dogs and snakes when they learned about ecosystems, saw pictures of oysters and oyster toadfish and ospreys and kingfisher and dolphins and crabs and all the animals that actually live here in New York Harbor. And then in addition to that, we have field stations at about 10 sites throughout the harbor. And those are oyster reefs that we install at sites where New Yorkers can walk down into the water. And we prioritize environmental justice communities, those that are also most at risk of the impacts of climate change, and use our oyster reefs as a narrative to get people down to the water's edge, interacting with local species there and working together to restore the environment where they live. And so that's sort of, how we think about our programs throughout the harbor.
Thank you. And Silda, what about for New York makers? What projects are you working on, and how do you select the makers and products for your marketplace?
They're really good questions. Let me start with the second half of that first, where we select our makers and the products for the marketplace. So at this point in time, and this has shifted over time as we become more known to the makers, we're kind of equal parts having makers come to us and continuing to discover makers through every way possible, going to fairs. COVID made that a little difficult, but online programs where we could discover different makers. Then we take a look at the products that they're offering. We use a standard that there is basically kind of like there's a platinum, gold, silver kind of standard in our minds, looking in terms of how local, how environmental the product is, how that we're looking at. We also are looking at trying to fill out a full offering of products for our clients and customers who are shopping on the site. And we, if it's created here and you're using local products in order to be able to create the product, that's an ideal. The more that's done in New York, the better. But there are some that also have wonderful stories that are a little bit less than that, but they are equally powerful. And so we just look for kind of an authentic through line of having New York be very much a part of the product's stories. And we like to try all the different products ourselves. And we're looking to see whether this is something that we would want to give as a gift to someone else, or that we would want to buy for ourselves. So hopefully that curated aspect makes it a much more enjoyable experience for customers who are coming on looking for things to buy. In terms of what projects we're working on now, one of the things we're doing is we're really scaling Silda's jams, which we have been making, and we're looking to source it with even our local supply chains for the fruit. We use local New York maple syrup, which is a very expensive item to include as part of your ingredients if you look at the cost of sugar versus maple syrup. But it's something that we felt very passionate about keeping as part of that product. We have are talking with a distributor who's local, who has their own social impact story, because they work with special needs adult communities to provide jobs. And so this is something we're very excited about. And so this has taken us in a kind of a direction that allows us to connect very personally with our makers, the maker community, and what is involved and where the challenges are in being a maker.
Thank you for that. And just to share with our audience, we will be sharing information in a follow-up email about all these incredible organizations, and for New York makers, a link to their website. So if you want to try out Silda's Jam, you'll be able to do that. Clearly, your organizations are incredible and making a huge difference in New York and far beyond New York. And you're at the forefront, really leading the charge on this. So, what are the things you're proudest of having done to make a difference? Who wants to start?
I can go. So for, and this takes us back in time a little bit too. What to my childhood when I was growing up, I took a small boat from Fisher's Island in Connecticut to that was our sort of driveway, because you had to, there's no sort of grocery store or anything like that on Fisher's Island. So, and I went to school in Connecticut. So the going back and forth across Fisher's Island Sound in a small boat is how I grew up. And I remember thinking, identifying Fisher's Island Sound, which is this spectacularly beautiful natural place, as my front yard. It wasn't ours. I didn't own it or anything, but I identified as, I built a sense of ownership over that environment because I was always there. And as we work with students from New York Harbor School and from schools all over New York City, we see, my proudest moments when I see in the faces of these public school students that same sense of ownership when they look out over New York Harbor, and the same sense of ownership when they pull trash out of New York Harbor or put oysters into New York Harbor. The idea that this is mine, it's my responsibility to take care of it, and through the work that I do in school, I can improve it. And that's watching young people become experts in their fields and take ownership over New York Harbor is definitely what gets me out of bed every morning.
What an amazing gift to give to the next generation. Miranda, how about you?
It's really similar. We are, I won't say our target audience because it's too big a population for that, but our sweet spot in terms of audience is the 60% of people in the US who are freaked out about the climate crisis, but don't know how to take action that will feel meaningful. And so are shut down and essentially silent about it. 60% as of December 2020. So when our work touches people in a way that empowers them to feel that they can take action that connects them to a community of climate protagonism, which is our whole goal, to build toward just solutions by taking action together as a broad community, as interlocking series of constituencies. The appetite that people have for that, and the resolve that they express, and it's something like joy too that they express in that sense of, to use your word, Pete, of ownership over their own actions and over their own ability to make choices about how they show up as citizens and as people in the society. That is an absolutely profoundly rewarding experience that we've had even more than I was confident we would at the start of the Climate Museum. And I've always been very bullish about it. And then I'll say too, on a day-to-day level, I have the privilege of working with the most extraordinary human beings, the most community-minded, supportive, remarkable people. They're incredible in terms of their talent, for sure. But beyond that, they're incredible in terms of their ability to build a trusting team that can weather just about any misstep or any mistake because we have each other's backs. So building a startup is building an organization is not an easy thing to do, as you know, Wendy, Pete, Silda, you know that in the first person way too, right? And having people that you can count on and who can count on you is totally essential, and also really, really motivating.
Okay, on to Silda. You've had such a rich background of experiences. What do you feel has made the biggest difference for you?
I think it really starts with having actually created the platform and telling the stories, which was the dream. And out of that, having a real sense of community there for the makers to feel appreciated. We know of instances where makers have reached out to other makers that they've seen on the site to be able to help them source materials or to work together on projects. During COVID, we had some really, I mean, that's, as you're saying, Miranda, where you really see the coming together. So we had some instances where we didn't know, nobody really knew when COVID was starting out what was going to happen, but everybody was very isolated in their places. So one, we wanted to be able to continue to reach customers and help them, even though we didn't know how they were impacted economically. But life goes on, birthdays happen, things happen that you want to recognize. So we worked with our makers to come up with free shipping for a while, where we all took a hit on some part of what we would be getting in order to make that available to our customers, so that they would be able to source things more easily. We also had a period where we gave portions of our proceeds to different food banks around the state when it became clear that the food shortage was a serious kind of effect of this in particular. And then one of the most beautiful things from the customer side, we got an order a few weeks ago when the stimulus checks came out, and I don't know if this is for sure, but there was an order placed for many different makers all in one order, and the total for everything pretty much matched the amount of the stimulus check. And I thought that was just such an amazing way, or thoughtful for this customer to be able to reach out and try to help the makers on the ground and know how important it was for them to support them.
That is a very powerful story. So, Miranda, as you mentioned, this can be a challenge to have a vision and really want to drive it forward, but then get involved with the logistics of funding and challenges to implement your ideas. So for all of you, I'd love to understand what are the biggest challenges to your work, and what gives you courage to keep driving forward? Miranda, why don't we start with you?
I think the biggest challenge in the Climate Museum, I mean, I think most anybody who's running a nonprofit will tell you that raising the funds that you need to thrive is just a foundational constant challenge. So there's that. But in addition, the particularly starting up a new, quite ambitious nonprofit organization in mid-career and midlife, it means you have to be uncomfortable again. You're a beginner again. And so the biggest challenges are really the challenges that also turn out to provide the biggest rewards. It's letting yourself be on a very steep part of the learning curve, kind of all the time in a renewed way, whether it's discovering the joys of signing a lease in a commercial real estate setting, and recognizing that there are 50 complicated subtasks that you never would have been able to identify, or learning accounting, or whatever it is, something that's well outside of your remit, your pre-existing remit. That kind of comes at you constantly, and you're also facing existential threats around funding. Right now, we're looking to expand out into a year-round permanent location. So that's a whole nother fantastically exciting, but also very challenging set of learning opportunities, I'll call them. But the reality is, it's not that isn't, I shouldn't even joke about that, because it puts you in a position where to survive, or it has put me in a position where to survive psychologically, I need to have my growth mindset hat on all of the time. And I've discovered that almost any challenge, however novel it is, however profoundly anxiety provoking it might seem at first, becomes completely manageable and interesting once you approach it from the standpoint of how am I going to learn and grow through confronting this? What's on the learning list of this commercial real estate lease? And that is that so as is so often the case, the challenge and its remedy are deeply locked together. And as everyone can already tell, I draw just a huge amount of courage, encouragement, comfort, energy from the people I'm privileged to work with and from the communities that we engage with and serve. So the challenges are strongly outweighed. They're formidable, but strongly outweighed by the learning opportunities and the connection opportunities of doing this kind of work.
And I love that concept of, instead of looking at challenges only as challenges, to look at them as growth and learning opportunities. That's a great perspective to have. How about for you, Pete?
Well, as a public school teacher, we call those teachable moments.
Yeah.
And so I could have said everything that Miranda just said, starting from the challenge of getting funding all the way up to the for us, it's government contracts. That was my big moment. But we're training teenagers to scuba dive in New York Harbor, right? So and trying to affect change in two incredibly complex, slow-moving and challenging systems, New York Harbor and the New York City Department of Education. So there's a massive amounts of red tape, massive amounts of inertia going in the wrong direction in both of those systems. And so there's a ton, every day there's new interesting challenges and new interesting walls to butt our heads up against and try to get around and over and through. And similar to Miranda, we wouldn't be anywhere without our team. We have a fantastic team of 30 change makers who work together to make that happen. And for us, putting an oyster reef in the water requires the same permitting requirements as building a mall or installing a bridge, right? There's a million rules to keep bad things out of the water and no rules to facilitate putting good things back in the water. So in a given year, a few years ago, we submitted 4,000 unique pages of permitting documents to get permission to put our oyster reefs in. So that's a huge challenge. And then, but I think it's the creative problem solving aspect and just the, knowing that if we keep pushing, you start getting, the first oyster reef we got permission for was 50 square feet. It was a tiny little postage stamp, and that was the biggest thing we could install. And then over time, we slowly get permission for larger and larger installations. And now, we do multi-acre sites and work with 100 schools. And so it's just slowly, over time, keep turning the wheel, and we are able to increase our impact.
That's terrific. And I love the way you've been able to drive growth and impact at the same time. Now, Silda, we heard Miranda talk about the challenges of being a nonprofit and raising funds. You chose to opt for a for-profit.com business to achieve your goals. And I'm curious, is it possible to achieve both profit and purpose? And is the funding considerations, is that any different for you? And so what's your greatest challenge, and how does the fact that you're a for-profit impact that?
Well, I actually love to hear both Miranda and Pete talking about this, because I did at one point start and run a not-for-profit for a number of years. And my feeling is that if you're going to have a not-for-profit, you have to run it like a for-profit business, because at the end of the day, it is about getting the capital or grants, however you want to call that, and using it well. And so it's all the same challenges that you face there, or different challenges, but sort of the same. It's like you're running a business, whether it's a not-for-profit or whether it's a for-profit. For us, we had this goal, this image, this mission. And so we are kind of a hybrid of being this mission driven, but for profit. because we were working in commerce. So it made no, like, how do we deal with the IRS when we're having all these sales? And it needs to be sustainable. And I feel like whether it's for profit or not for profit, you've got to figure out how to have a sustainable organization. I would say our challenges have been enormous. Every day, we learn more, we grow more, and then we face more challenges. Ours as being a .com business, so we're up against the Goliaths of Amazon, trying to work with Google and Facebook algorithms to keep ourselves in front of people so that they know we even exist. And our experience has been is whenever we kind of manage to get a crack in that wall and get going, they change the algorithms. And so we're back to starting all over again in terms of being visible to folks. So getting the word out about us is one of the challenges that we have faced all along. There are many challenges to being an online retail business, just in terms of basic margins. Plus, we're dealing with locally made products, so they tend to be more expensive because of the way that the products and the materials that they're using are sourced. And so constant challenges to get that message to the customers and connect with those customers who understand and want to support those efforts. I think that during COVID, that really resonated. It was like people just got it all of a sudden. It was great. I don't know what happens as we come out of COVID and go back into something that is a more normalized way of living. So our kind of mode of being has been to adapt to from the very beginning, to figure out, oh, we need to emphasize the marketplace instead of the magazine, because that's where the revenues are going to come from for now. And then how do we balance that with the telling of the stories? We've also gotten a fiscal sponsorship in recent months as a way to try to augment and you find separate funding for some of the kind of more mission driven, sort of not-for-profit components that actually complement and work to support the for-profit piece. So it's a challenge every day, and adaptability and growth is their key. So
yeah, and you brought up the point about the pandemic and how you have to really adapt to it. And Pete, I'm curious, you collect oyster shells generally from over 70 restaurants in New York City. And now we've got the pandemic, and it's had a particularly devastating impact on the restaurant industry. So I'm curious how your work has been impacted by the pandemic. And then after this question, we're going to go to a couple of lightning rounds and then go to our audience questions. So I just want to remind the audience, please feel free to click in the Q&A and write in your questions for our panelists. So thanks. So Pete, if you could address how you've pivoted during the pandemic, that would be really interesting to hear.
Yeah, so we use oyster shells as a component of our reef substrate, and then we in a lab setting get oyster larvae to attach to the shells, and then we have live oysters on shells that are then put down on reefs around the harbor. And so we collect shells from restaurants to do that, as you said, Wendy, and that we suspended our shell collection program in March last year and just started it back up in September. So we haven't had an incoming stream of shell. Fortunately, we have over 1 million pounds of shell on Governor's Island waiting to be used. So we have a stock there. And there are other structures we can use and other techniques we can use to restore oysters without the shell. So our hearts go out to all of our restaurant partners, and not just the restaurant partners, but all of their suppliers. So we also work with a lot of oyster farms who are just as hard hit as the restaurants because there's no one to buy their oysters. and and but we have been able to pivot to continue doing our restoration work, and also the more profound impact on our day to day is not being able to gather in groups, because so much of what we do is bringing people together at the water's edge. And so we spent several months last year bringing all of our education programs online. The idea that if we can't bring people together at the water's edge, how do we get New York Harbor into people's living rooms? And developed a lot of content, educational content, to support teachers and parents and students who are doing remote learning for the first time. And everything from just video tours of the harbor to specific locations, to how to use our curriculum, how to monitor oyster reefs at home, and all of that. So that was the big shift for us in the pandemic. But we have just opened up our volunteer days again. So we're having in-person volunteer days on Governor's Island, and our education programs are slowly moving back to in-person now.
That's terrific. And Miranda, I know so many of your programs were based in the museum. So you also had to adapt to this virtual world. How have you been able to be agile and keep people engaged in the important issues you addressed during the pandemic?
It became it became a silver lining, because developing a strong online presence was something that was always on our to-do list every month, and always fell off the bottom of it, because we were so captivated by the public's response and by the need being expressed for pathways into climate engagement. And the pandemic forced us to develop a whole suite of capacities that we didn't have before. So that's the first thing I would say. And then the second thing I would say is that we were very lucky in not having, we were about to move out of very generously loaned office space, which we were starting to outgrow. And we ended up not quite finding the right thing mere weeks before the pandemic hit. So we would have been in a really jeopardized situation if we'd had a standing rent obligation. And so there's a good deal of, there's that cliche about how it's better to be lucky than good. Obviously you want to try for both, but in a pinch, if you have to choose, we also had some really good luck in our situation. And then the people who we've been able to attract to the mission and draw into the team were really willing to lean in to make the extra effort to maintain our sense of community and trust through that really discombobulating, particularly first few months of trying to relate to each other through the screen, of trying to draw the public in and connect with the public and allow members of the public to connect with each other through the screen. So I would say those three things are the main takeaways for me.
Yeah, that's terrific. And really one of the silver linings to the pandemic, which obviously is really horrible, and we would rather that it hadn't occurred, but it's enabled everybody to develop this virtual presence online, which for you, Miranda, and for really all our panels, enables you to be educating people from around the world, not just in New York, who are visiting the museum. And so I'd love to close with 2 lightning round sessions. The first question is, and we'll have all of you address it. This one will start with Silda. What do you hope our audience will take away from our discussion? Quick thoughts on this.
Well, I hope that folks will act on what they care about, because I think that they can have the biggest impact where it is meaningful and authentic to the individual, and to not just think about it, but to actually act on it and live in a way that's consistent with their interest and beliefs.
Pete, what about for you?
I'm going to assume that there's that many of the attendees here tonight live in New York City. But so for me, in addition to knowing that you can participate in all of this stuff and help us achieve our goals, I'd also hope that everyone thinks a little differently about New York Harbor next time you're going over the Manhattan Bridge in a train, or walking along the Hudson River Park Promenade, you look out at the harbor and know that there are oysters and seahorses and dolphins and black sea bass and all of those animals just right below the surface.
Thank you. And Miranda, what about you? What do you hope our audience will take away from our discussion?
Well, I love both of those. And I would add, talk climate. 66% of us are worried. 62% of us rarely or never discuss it. Let's change that second number. Start by having a conversation about this panel, or it could be about climate and public health, or climate and social justice. Climate is an everything issue. The more people are talking about it, the more change we're going to see in a positive direction.
Okay, and I'd love to inspire those in our audience to strive to make a difference in their lives and their communities in whatever way they can. So next question is, what advice do you have for others who want to make a difference? Pete, let's start with you on this one.
Well, I think it depends on what kind of difference you want to make, but there's a unlimited opportunities to plug into various things going on in New York City. So any social justice cause, environmental cause, volunteer at your local school, go, number one, come out to Governor's Island and volunteer with Billy and Oyster Project and help put oysters in the water. But there are, if you want to make a difference, I would just start making a difference. There's a million different ways to do that here in New York City.
Terrific. How about you, Silda?
Well, I would say to make choices that align with your beliefs, whether it is in the nonprofit arena as well as in the commercial for-profit arena. So be thoughtful about how you're using your dollars and know that they make a difference. So think it all the way through and engage. That's just, we need to build sustainable community. And the only way to do that is to be there for each other and to interact with each other.
Thank you. Miranda, we'll end with you.
Yeah, I believe in your own agency, recognize your own agency. You have the power to make a difference every day in how you connect with other people, how you think about the world around you, and the actions you take in both the private sphere and in a public facing way, whether that's calling your bank, calling your legislator, joining a demonstration. Recognize your agency and seek justice.
Okay, I love those comments. It's really great in terms of really inspiring our audience to make a difference. I heard Ryan Gellert, who's CEO of Patagonia, speak last week, and he said that change comes from people who refuse to believe that things worth doing can't be done, and that you all clearly epitomize that. So moving on into some of our questions from our audience. This one really is directed to you, I think, Pete. Are you familiar with the Oyster Rejuvenation Project in Yonkers?
So I'm not, I saw that in the Q&A, and I'm not exactly sure which project the question is referring to, but I can tell you that any oysters that have been restored in Yonkers came from Billy and Oyster Project. So
okay, terrific. That's good to know. And we have a question I think that's really probably directed to you, Miranda. It seems that there's a huge political divide in recognizing climate issues. So how does your organization address these issues? And Miranda, we'll start with you, but if anybody else wants to address it after that, feel free.
Great. So I think I'd say a couple things. One is that divide it exists in the political elite, but it's much less present in the population as a whole. That's qualified. And I'm not saying it's absent in the population as a whole, but for example, the support for clean energy solutions and progress on clean energy, government support for clean energy, all of those kinds of questions are answered with broad affirmative support across the political spectrum. And the numbers change a little when you're moving from left to right, but they don't change as much as you might think seeing media reports. Also, it's changing generationally. Young people know that they have a right to a livable future, whether they are conservative or progressive. And so you see cohorts of young Republicans starting climate organizations within the established parameters of their political party to try to change the official party position on these questions. Then the third thing is we want to help support a broad cultural shift on climate. And that means that we're less interested. For example, we don't direct anything to denialists at all. We think they're impervious to the evidence. That's been demonstrated repeatedly in our view. What we want to do is give people who already want to act but don't know what they could do that would be meaningful, don't know how to connect with climate community, or feel ashamed and complicit in a way that has no basis, but that's very culturally available to step out of those mindsets and feel empowered to take action. And those people run the gamut politically, but that's our focus rather than healing the tribalist partisan divide that's been fomented more broadly in American political culture.
Silda, do you have any thoughts about this? You've certainly had experience in navigating the political climate. What are your thoughts? You're on mute.
Want to avoid the dogs. I think Miranda's spot on here is focusing on the issue and trying to look at it outside the framing that has been kind of superimposed upon it from the different political perspectives, and just allowing people individually to connect with the real importance of the work that she's doing and that needs to be done with respect to climate and the environment.
Pete, do you have anything you want to add to this?
Well, the way we see it is it's a, we see, I think of it sometimes as just not having enough people on our team, right? So, and our team is the team that sort of identifies nature differently or tries to find ways to live with nature, or thinks about ways they can change their behavior to have a smaller impact on climate. And at Belly and Oyster Project, the way that we grow the numbers of people who identify as having a connection to nature is by providing that connection to nature. So I think that I think climate change stands out as this massive existential threat, but I also think it's symptomatic of this larger issue of losing a connection with the natural world and thinking that we can live apart from the natural world. And that so the way that we combat that is just by trying to flip that switch in as many people as possible. So once you know that you can't live separate from nature and your actions have an impact on natural world and you can affect positive change through the things you do every day, then you can approach life in a different way.
I love the way you've all touched on this issues in slightly different ways, but all tied together. Now we have another politically based question about the American Rescue Plan Act. And there are so many opportunities with the funding that it affords. And this particular question is, what opportunities do you see with the funding from the Act for summer and after school programs, and for other elements to support small businesses? So the first part of the program, the question, is really geared to Miranda and Pete, and the last part with respect to small businesses to Silda. We'll start with Miranda and Pete.
Well, I'm going to hand it right over to you, Pete, because I just don't know the answer. I wish I did, and I apologize.
I'm right there with you, Miranda. We do a fair amount of work with summer and after school programs, specifically at New York Harbor School, and I'm excited to learn more about how we can how that can be facilitated by the American Rescue Act, but I don't know right now how that lines up.
Okay, thanks for that. Silda, how about on the small business end?
Well, I think I'm in the same place in terms of understanding what the specifics are that are actually in the plan. I do know that the PPP that came out in the immediate face of the pandemic was very, very helpful for those small businesses who were able to get it. I know there were a lot of issues with some larger companies getting it too, but there was some real impact for that, and it happened very quickly and was very important, I think. And so I'm assuming there will be more pieces of this that will be there to provide some supports for the small business, but I do not know the specifics of it. So sorry, I can't comment on it more.
Okay, and I know I was looking into this for a client, and there's a lot of funding both at the federal level and at the New York State level with the new budget geared to small businesses. So for example, the restaurant industry is really excited about the support that that can provide for them to overcome the devastation of the pandemic. And hopefully, Pete, that will yield more oysters for you for your programs. So we have another question for Miranda from somebody who seems to really know the details about climate change and carbon emissions. So the question is, do you have a view as to the application of nanotechnologies such as graphene nanotubes as a way to eliminate greenhouse gases?
Here's what I'd say. The answer is no, but there are a lot of either exotic or potentially unscalable and certainly unknown technologies, unproven technologies, some of which we've poured enormous amounts of public money into, like carbon capture. There have been huge attempts to scale carbon capture. We haven't figured out how to do it yet. It's been an effort ongoing over decades. Here's the reality. A lot of these shiny new tech fixes are a way to distract us from the fundamental fact that we have the renewable energy technology that we need to a very, very large extent. There's some pockets of very hard problems to solve, like aviation, shipping, concrete, and other heavy industrial applications they're really hard to solve. But for the most part, for the next 10 years, what we need is energy efficiency deployed on a massive scale, and clean energy scaled up very, very, very aggressively and rapidly, and all of this integrated across the economy and across the society. So the new technologies that are being promoted are often being promoted by the fossil fuel industry, which would very much like to distract us all from the pressing need to stop burning its product. So for example, it's BP that gave us the term carbon footprint in 2004. That's a PR scam that was designed to keep us focused on our own consumption in an anxious mode rather than to focus on what they're doing. So I don't know the details of nanotechnology at all. But in general, we have the technology we need to take the steps that are necessary now to put us on a pathway to 1.5 degrees Celsius maximum temperature change for our planet.
Thank you. And our last question I love, and I'm curious to hear the answer too. If you all had to start another completely new enterprise from scratch today, what would it be and why? Let's start with Pete.
It would be Billy and Oyster Project because for all of the reasons we've talked about tonight, I would definitely do it a lot differently. But that's what, if I could start something else right now, that's what it would be.
And what would you do differently? Briefly, a couple of points.
Oh man, everything. I mean, it would just learning as we go through a series of unfortunate events and challenging, teachable moments. So I think that there's a, interesting. One thing that it took us a while to land on was engaging 1 million people and restoring 1 billion oysters. And I think that we exist between the environmental space and the education space, and that is sometimes works to our advantage and sometimes is confusing to funders or other folks who want to put us in one of those two boxes. And Billion Oyster Project is our name, and so we haven't honored the educational goals in the same way as having a ambitious target to reach for. And so I think we probably would have done that earlier. Um, you know,
Silda, for you, what would be your new enterprise?
Well, I would love to start New York Makers, knowing everything that I now know and have toiled to be able to learn, and be able to do it with a lot more capital, so I know where to deploy it from day one. So that is what I would do.
And Miranda, how about you?
I too want a do-over. I love this time travel opportunity that you guys have articulated, Pete and Silda. And I was going to say, when you first asked the question, the Climate Museum in San Francisco. But I think I can imagine a number of different enterprises that would have a similar goal of supporting a broad cultural shift toward action on the climate crisis. That could be super compelling, including broad curricular efforts along the lines of what you guys have done, Pete, and community building efforts that are regionally defined along the lines of what you're doing, Silda. So I think there are a lot of different spaces for people to occupy in the fight that we're all making toward sustainable community, toward an ecologically sound environment, even in the greatest city of all, and toward a climate safe present and future. So I think there's a lot of new stuff that needs doing, even though I'm very happy doing what it is that I do every day.
Thank you. Those are really great insights. And I'm so happy that you all shared such rich information, not only about your organizations and what they're doing to make a difference, but really also such candid thoughts about your journey and the challenges and the importance of turning challenges into opportunities to grow and learn, and being willing to fail, because really the only way to drive change is to be willing to fail along the way and then learn how to do it better, which is what we all aspire to. So I really want to thank you, Silda, Pete, and Miranda, for joining us to share your incredibly compelling insights about making a difference and how we can all create a positive impact for New York State and for our world. And you've certainly inspired us all to do that. And Pete and Miranda, I know your organizations both have been located on Governor's Island in buildings right next to each other, and your teams have worked together quite deeply, but you hadn't actually met before today. So I'm hoping that this program, now that we've brought you together, you'll find opportunities to collaborate, because there's certainly a lot of synergies in what you're doing. And it would be so wonderful for this Making a Difference series to actually make a difference in itself. I want to thank the Princeton Club of New York, Yale Nonprofit Alumni Association, and Conscious Capitalism New York City for co-sponsoring this program. And a big thank you to everyone who joined us this evening. The Princeton Club is recording the talk, and we'll be sending everyone the link together with the information about all these amazing organizations. I hope you'll join us for our upcoming programs, including 2 more sustainability focused programs on Earth Day, April 22nd, and then again on April 27th, both at 7 p.m., where I'll be speaking with heads of sustainability for Unilever, Colgate, Danone, Ben & Jerry's, and Societe Generale. So thank you all for being a part of this extraordinary discussion. And we're so happy to be able to bring thought-provoking programs like these to our members and to our audience that you can enjoy from the comfort of your living room. Thank you so much, Miranda, Silda, and Pete, for your insights.
Thank you.
thanks so much for having us.
And thank you to everyone in our audience for joining us this evening.